Nasir Caldwell had a spark that lit up every room he walked into. At just 15, he was the kind of kid people believed was destined for greatness. Tall, quick on his feet, and armed with a killer jump shot, Nasir wasn't just a basketball player. He was a future star. Coaches saw it. Friends admired it. Even strangers could tell there was something special about him. Basketball wasn't just a game for Nasir. It was his dream, his escape, his way of making sense of the world. On the court, he was untouchable, his movements smooth, his shots precise. He could almost hear the roar of an NBA crowd in his head every time he practiced. But life has a cruel way of testing those with the brightest futures. And for Nasir, the game he loved so much would soon be overshadowed by a darkness he never saw coming. Nasir's mother, Monique Caldwell, was his biggest cheerleader. Ever since Nasir's father passed away when he was just 10, she had played both roles, mother and father, protector and provider. Life as a single mom wasn't easy, but Monique did everything in her power to ensure Nasir never felt the absence of a father figure. She worked long shifts, sometimes 2 jobs, to keep the lights on and food on the table. She never complained, never asked for help. Monique was a fighter, just like Nasir. They had a saying between them, us against the world. But no matter how strong she was, Monique never saw the storm brewing within her own family. She never imagined that the person she trusted the most could be the reason she would lose the one thing she cherished above all else, her son. Enter Tobias Langford, a man admired, respected, and seemingly perfect. The CEO of a major healthcare company. Tobias had money, influence, and an effortless charm that made people trust him. He was Monique's older brother. And after Nasir's father passed, he stepped in as a father figure. At first, Tobias seemed like a blessing. He took Nasir on trips, bought him gifts, and talked about life's success and the importance of being strong. A man stands on his own 2 feet, he would say, patting Nasir's shoulder. You're going to be great, kid. To the outside world, Tobias was the perfect uncle. But behind closed doors, he was something else entirely. Nasir started to dread the moments they were alone. At first, it was subtle, an overly long hug, a hand resting too long on his back. But soon, those moments turned into whispered threats, manipulation, and something much darker. Nasir was trapped in a nightmare he couldn't escape. He feared that if he spoke out, no one would believe him. Tobias was powerful, respected, and calculating. He knew how to twist reality, how to make Nasir feel like he was the one who would ruin everything if he ever said a word. So Nasir stayed silent. But silence has a price. Tobias Langford had spent years perfecting his mask. He knew exactly how to make people trust him, how to hide the monster beneath his expensive suits and polished smiles. No one suspected a thing, not Monique, not Nasir's friends, not even the community that saw him as a role model. But Nasir was growing older, stronger. He was no longer the scared little boy Tobias could control. The fear that once paralyzed him was turning into something else. Anger. One evening, Nasir sat in his room staring at a blank page in his notebook. His hands trembled as he picked up a pen. He couldn't keep it in anymore. He needed to tell someone. And the only person he could trust was the one person he wanted to protect the most. His mother. Mom, there's something I need to tell you. He began writing, pouring his pain onto the page, exposing the truth Tobias had worked so hard to bury. Little did he know, that letter would be the key to everything. And the reason Tobias Langford would come back one final time. April 18th, 2024, started like any other day, or so Monique Caldwell thought. The sun peeked through the blinds as she walked down the hallway toward Nasir's room. She smiled, already hearing the words in her head. Wake up, superstar. Time for school. But the moment she stepped inside, something felt wrong. Nasir was always up early, always ready for the day. But today he was still, too still. Nasir, she called, her voice soft at first. Then louder. Nasir, wake up. Nothing. A mother's intuition is a powerful thing. In an instant, dread gripped Monique's heart. She reached out, shaking him gently. His skin was cold. Her breath caught in her throat. No, 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 no. Shaking hands. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911. her voice cracking with terror. "My son, he's not waking up. Please send someone." Paramedics arrived within minutes, their movements quick and practiced. But it didn't take long for them to confirm what Monique already feared. Nasir was gone. Collapsed on the floor, Monique's sobs filled the room. The world around her blurred. The only thing she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat hammering in her chest. Her son, her baby, was gone, and somewhere in the shadows, the man responsible believed he had gotten away with it. The days after Nasir's death felt like a fog to Monique. She went through the motions, funeral arrangements, calls with family, endless condolences, but none of it felt real. How could it? Her son, her baby, was gone. People told her Nasir's death was a tragedy, a sudden and unexplainable loss. Sometimes these things just happen, a doctor said. But Monique wasn't convinced. Something was off. Nasir had been perfectly healthy. He had no medical conditions, no history of illness. And the way she had found him that morning, still quiet, cold, it haunted her. Then there was Tobias. At first, he did what any grieving uncle would do. He stayed by Monique's side, comforting her, making arrangements, telling stories about Nasir. But something about his grief didn't feel real. He was too present, too controlled. And there was one detail Monique couldn't shake from her mind. The night before Nasir died, Tobias had been at their house. He had left abruptly, without explanation. And now, Nasir was dead. She pushed the thought away. Tobias was family. He had been there for them through everything. Hadn't he? But grief has a way of sharpening your instincts. And in Monique's heart, a seed of doubt had been planted. And soon, she would discover just how right she was. It started with the investigators. Nasir's death had been ruled suspicious due to the lack of a clear cause. The medical examiner found no obvious signs of trauma, but something wasn't adding up. The toxicology report was pending, but it would take time. So they searched Nasir's room, hoping to find anything that could explain what had happened. That's when they found it, tucked away beneath Nasir's mattress, pressed between the fabric and the frame, was a letter, unopened, unfinished, and it changed everything. The moment Monique saw Nasir's handwriting, her heart stopped. She unfolded the letter with trembling hands, her breath catching as she read the words her son had never been able to say out loud. "Mom, there's something I need to tell you." The words that followed shattered her world. Nasir had been suffering in silence. The uncle she trusted, the man who had been a father figure, was not the man she thought he was. Tobias had been hurting Nasir for years, manipulating him, controlling him, threatening him. And now, Nasir was gone. Monique's hands shook as she clutched the letter to her chest. She couldn't breathe. She had trusted Tobias. And now, she realized he had stolen everything from her. The moment the letter was handed to investigators, the case shifted. Nasir hadn't just died. He had been silenced. But there was one question that haunted the detectives. If Tobias had killed Nasir to keep him quiet, why hadn't he taken the letter? It was hidden, yes, but not impossible to find. If Tobias knew Nasir was planning to expose him, wouldn't he have searched every inch of the room to destroy the evidence? Unless he hadn't known about it. That meant Nasir had written the letter just before he died. He had finally found the courage to speak out. And that courage had cost him his life. Now, the investigators had their target. They just needed proof. And soon they found it. It was a grainy black and white security camera feed from a neighbor's house. The timestamp, April 17th, 11:42 p.m. The image, Tobias Langford's car, parked several streets away from the Caldwell home. Why would he park so far away? Unless he didn't want to be seen. The footage showed Tobias walking toward the house. He stayed inside for 14 minutes. That was all he needed. Investigators now had a timeline. Tobias had come to Nasir's room that night, just hours before his death. At first, they believed he had come to threaten Nasir one last time, to make sure he stayed silent. But Tobias had underestimated Nasir's courage. Nasir must have stood his ground, and Tobias must have realized he had no other choice. He left the house that night believing he controlled the situation. But then, He must have had second thoughts. What if Nazir told someone in the morning? What if his world collapsed? He couldn't take that risk. And so, in the dead of night, Tobias returned. Tobias knew the house too well. He didn't need to break in. He didn't need to force his way inside. He already knew where the spare key was. The camera didn't catch him the second time. He had parked even farther away, taking no chances. But the evidence was clear. Tobias had entered Nazir's room while he was asleep. The final forensic report revealed the chilling truth. Nazir hadn't died naturally. He had been poisoned. A lethal injection of potassium chloride, a substance that stops the heart almost instantly. Silent, undetectable, the perfect crime, if not for Nazir's letter. Tobias had slipped out of the house undetected. Certainly it erased every trace of his crime. He had no idea that Nazir's final act of courage would be the very thing that exposed him. But justice was coming. And Tobias Langford was about to face the consequences of his betrayal. Tobias Langford had spent his entire life controlling narratives. As a high-profile healthcare CEO, he had built a reputation on trust and responsibility. He was a man people turned to for advice, the man communities respected, the man who seemed incapable of wrongdoing. But beneath that polished surface, he was something else entirely. A manipulator, a predator, and now a murderer. The night he killed Nazir, he thought he had executed the perfect crime. A silent injection of potassium chloride, undetectable in a routine autopsy. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, no obvious foul play. Nazir had simply gone to sleep and never woken up. Tobias believed he had covered every track. No witnesses, no evidence, no suspicion. But there was one thing he hadn't planned for, Nazir's letter. And now, the walls around Tobias Langford were beginning to close in. The moment the toxicology report came back, it confirmed what investigators had already suspected. Nazir had been poisoned. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a medical condition. It was murder. And with Nazir's letter, the security footage and the medical findings, detectives had everything they needed. There was only one piece missing. Tobias's reaction. They needed to see if he would break. So they set a trap. Monique, despite her grief, agreed to meet with Tobias one last time. A hidden microphone recorded everything. Tobias, she said, her voice trembling. I need to know what happened that night. Tobias hesitated. His usual confidence flickered. Just for a second. Monique, you're grieving. Nazir's death was a tragedy, he said, his voice dripping with the same false warmth that had fooled her for years. I love that boy. Monique's fingers clenched under the table. I know about the letter. For the first time, Tobias faltered. He blinked. His jaw tensed. He wasn't expecting that. And in that split second, Monique saw it. The truth behind his carefully constructed mask. The monster beneath. She leaned in. Nazir told me everything. Tobias inhaled sharply. His hand twitched. And then, in a moment of arrogance, he made his final mistake. You don't understand, Monique. I had to do it. Silence. Then Monique's whisper. You just confessed. And with that, the trap snapped shut. When Tobias Langford was arrested on May 12, 2024, the community was in shock. People couldn't believe it. The successful CEO, the charming philanthropist, the man who had dedicated his life to healthcare, a murderer? But the evidence was overwhelming. The letter, the security footage, the toxicology report, the recorded confession. Tobias's carefully curated world crumbled overnight. At first, he denied everything. Then, under pressure, the cracks in his story began to show. Finally, in a moment of sheer desperation, he broke. I didn't want to hurt him, Tobias muttered in the interrogation room, his voice shaking. I was just scared. He was going to ruin everything. But the detectives weren't interested in his excuses. The only thing that mattered was justice for Nazir. The trial was swift. The prosecution painted a clear picture. Tobias Langford had spent years manipulating and abusing Nazir. And when Nazir found courage to speak out, Tobias silenced him in the most permanent way possible. The jury took less than 2 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty. On June 6, 2024, Tobias Langford was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Monique, it was justice. But it wasn't closure. Nothing would ever bring Nasir back. Nothing would ever fill the void his death had left. But at least the man who stole her son's future would never hurt anyone again. In the months that followed, Monique found herself struggling between grief and purpose. Nasir had died trying to tell the truth, and she would make sure his voice was never silenced again. She founded the Nasir Caldwell Foundation, an organization dedicated to protecting vulnerable children from predators, especially those hiding in plain sight. She spoke at schools. She shared Nasir's story. She warned parents about the dangers of trusting the wrong people. And through it all, she carried Nasir's memory with her. Her son had been courageous, and now his courage would save others.